Well, what we've said so far is simply praise, praise, praise for David Graeber and David Wengrow, who wrote The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. Beginning to fill in what I said was necessary for substantiation of the interrupted evolution hypothesis. And here are two who came along doing that, to my surprise, not because they have accepted that hypothesis. They're coming from a totally different direction, which is even more encouraging to me. Listen how they wind up, and then we'll go back. We can see more clearly now what's going on when a study that is rigorous in every other respect begins from the unexamined assumption that there was some original form of human society, that its nature was fundamentally good or evil, depending on which theory that you subscribe to, whether it's Rousseau or Hobbes, or that a time before inequality and political awareness existed, that there was such a time, and that something happened to change all this, that civilization and complexity always come at the price of human freedom, that participatory democracy is natural in small groups, but cannot possibly scale up to anything like a city or a nation state. We know now, on the basis of the studies that they are citing, that we are in the presence of myths in that construction. So one of the things that that pops up repeatedly in human history, particularly in intellectual history, is that we did it ourselves. Whatever we've accomplished, we've done ourselves, and pushing off the input from completely other cultures, completely different places that we actually absorbed and made part of our own. But no, we did it ourselves. To my mind, that's the after effect of having come out of the experience with the Anunnaki lords and not being able to, to swallow our pride and say that civilization was not our making, but was a gift. And so we got into this position that we've done it ourselves, and that keeps coming up over and over again. We'll see some examples. Like one of the most obvious, fairly recent ones was in the transition from the Dark Ages to the Enlightenment in Western Europe. There's this idea that we evolved this, and they completely dismiss something which was really interesting for me to discover. To me, it's completely new. How much influence the Europeans had from the North American indigenous culture. Because the Enlightenment thinkers, the authors that we know, Montesquieu, Diderot, Voltaire, they actually were able to admit to some extent in the form of their writings that the ideas about freedom, equality, rationality, and revealed religion as opposed to imposed religion really came to them from natives who were brought to Europe by French missionaries. One of the biggest impact came from a book called Jesuit Relations in New France, which was, widely available and read, and filled with new surprising ideas. The Frenchman who brought these ideas over in his book went by the name of La Hontan. And one of these books was The Curious Dialogues with a Savage of Good Sense Who Has Traveled. He was talking about a native wise man who had actually been to Montreal, New York, and Paris. Someone whose name was Candiaroc. And these books were structured as dialogues between this native man in French with the French intellectuals, prelates, theologians, and he was consistently besting them in argument because he was a great representative of the basic position of the natives, which was that their culture was far superior to the European culture. That, we'll get into this, I'll get into some of the specifics of that. But one of the important things is that book in French, and since it was in it was in multiple editions for over 100 years, all over Europe. It was translated into German, English, Dutch, and Italian, and if it was written in French, then it was known in Poland and Russia. And in these dialogues that are basically reproduced by Montesquieu and Diderot and others, they were accused of having these radical ideas about equality and freedom. And in order to not get their heads cut off, they put them into the mouth of a native, okay? But the truth was, there really was a native, who was delivering these insights to them, okay? So they were only slightly fictionalized, versions of what had actually gone on. And one of the things that that comes out of this, but we're jumping ahead so many centuries now, is one of the reasons why the right leans towards racism, that's got this weakness in the direction of racism, is because the left has indigenous roots. The left, the democratic ideal is really the way indigenous cultures were organized. The main difference, is that there's no compulsion. Nobody has to do anything that anybody else tells them to do. Okay, virtue is kind of inherent and understood, and people who steal get treated. They don't succeed very well. Okay? But they are not living under the law. And all men created equal means equal under the law. In our system, the way it's evolved, or at least in its present state of evolution, the law replaces the sovereign. So our Constitution is a functional equivalent of having a monarch. We got an executive, and we thought that since we have an elected executive, we got rid of the monarchy. But we really reestablished it, in a dominant law. And look at how people are now fighting over who's the more faithful to the Constitution. who's the better subject of the monarch? The Constitution. I'm not saying, anyway, I'm not knocking it too much, but what's worth noting about the Constitution is that, you know, what we call its fatal flaw, you know, that it didn't resolve the question of slavery. Well, slavery is really the extreme version of exploitation by the oligarchy. And the trouble, you know, in our system is that it injected democracy into a tradition of oligarchy and monarchy. In our case, the Constitution, the fundamental law, instead of being what it was originally intended to be as a consensus understanding of the best way to govern, becomes in itself a monarchical construct. So it's an incomplete integration of a grassroots understanding of governance, that life on land itself generates a system of personal freedom, but that's, you know, incompletely integrated with a top-down civilization model. No matter how nice you put it, what got imposed was very much a top-down model that has its roots in Anunnaki lordship. Okay, I'm jumping ahead and jumping around, but if you want me to slow down, stop, let me know.
Well, Mike,
yeah.
How would the notion of a representative type of government fit with what you're saying?
Well, from what we know, the council of all, the whole, you know, all of everyone, which not necessarily the males, you know, was the body of deliberation of the tribe. And there was always a popular assembly, as far as we can tell, in all from the tablets, in all of the Mesopotamian cultures, there was a popular assembly, and which was true in most of in many of the Greek states too. This was, I wouldn't say balanced, but ran in parallel with something like a Senate, you know, a council of the propertied ones, or the more propertied ones, or the more noble ones. How is it? Yeah, you're wondering, you know, how is it represented? Well, either well or badly. I'll put it that way. You know, it can work or it can fall apart, and that's one of the things that we're learning about now. You know, is it going to work or is it going to fall apart? Certainly, minority rule in a democratic system is a formula for disaster, and eventually produces upheaval and violence. Somebody's got background talking going on, but that's okay. It's not much. So, you know, in the, I'm not sure how well this answers what you're bringing up, Jim, but, you know, um, in the indigenous culture, equality is really in respect to each other. It's not a matter of equality under the law. People are free. There's no compulsion. There's no direct punishment for anything. And this is, one of the bases for the natives believing that their society was so much superior. That got reflected in Franklin's observation that many colonists were voting with their feet, and when they had experience of living with a native tribe, if they were ever brought back to civilization, as soon as they could, they escaped to the woods and went back to their native tribes that had adopted them. And that was articulated by Thomas Paine, who to him was clear that the natives in the woods around their settlements were living far happier, easier lives than the colonists were. And one of the interesting things about the books about this guy, Candiarak, was that he was quite an orator, and was very, very convincing. One of his telling points was questioning, since he was a native, he didn't get punished for this, but questioning Christianity itself. He said, look, if God was going to come to give a gift to all of mankind, why would he have done it to one man? Why would he have sent this message through one man? And then look what happens. All of the descendants and disciples of that one man start fighting each other. Like, this doesn't make sense. This couldn't have happened. They didn't quite know what to say to that. So I forgot to shut this off. I don't think I've done it properly, but hang on a moment. Do not disturb. Okay.
So he was somebody from the outside, but whose behavior was so acceptable that he couldn't be denied a presence and a voice, and he dissented often, more often than was normal in European society at that time.
Yes, yes, and you might say he was the spark of all the dissent.
Yeah.
Those who wrote, having had a glimpse of what life could be like, through this man from the other world. Now, one of the conclusions from the archaeology and anthropology that we're going to get into in a bit was that indigenous life is infinitely more complex and varied in reality than what was implied by my simply saying, well, they got away from the Anunnaki world and they found a way to live and prosper without the gods. But that's a pretty broad statement, and what our more modern archaeology and anthropology is discovering is that there's huge variation in sizes of communities. We're talking about settlements based on an indigenous life, a mix of fairly low intensity agriculture, really garden planting, not huge agriculture, and foraging and hunting, in communities of 10, 20,000 or more people, cities, okay? Settlements in a very, very different organization. I'll show you a picture of one of them, that at the same time, at the same size, as the Anunnaki rebuilt cities after the flood. In other words, 400 acres or so, and a few thousand people. Okay, that's to come. The conventional perceived wisdom is that crafts, esoteric knowledge, that they are impossible without agriculture and a structured, highly structured society. And that turns out to just not be true. And the question is, are those skills, and we're talking about cities that were laid out on basis of astronomy, alignment to rising points of the sun and stars, pretty sophisticated astronomical orientations, cities that were unified across huge distances by geometric principles, ones that were laid out in a similar way in the northern Mississippi Valley and in South America, with very, very similar geometric bases. And the question is, are these inherent in the human mind, and something that completely free people would come up with? Are they to some extent remnants of and memories of life under the Anunnaki that were retained in people who left but kept some of the pictures in mind? Because again, the picture is very, very mixed. Ponce de Leon came across a non-agricultural kingdom with royalty, along the Gulf Coast of Florida. Was this a memory of Anunnaki civilization? Was it an implant? Was it something inherent in Homo erectus to evolve this kind of rulership? No way to know at this point. Again, I know, are these inherent in the human brain, which of course is a hybrid brain, or is it carried in the human mind from experiences of the Anunnaki world? How much of that is conscious? Here's a picture. It's poorly shown in the book, and I don't know how well it's going to come across here, but that's a city with housing for about 20,000 people in a circle. And it's not clear what the function of the great space in the center is. These are individual houses arrayed, in this circular form. They seem to have some differentiation. The excavations of the houses show some trade craft. They seem to be organized in neighborhoods along the way, and there's this great avenue that runs through the center of the two lines of housing structures, and in the middle. I'll come a little closer. All right. Does this help any? In the center of that avenue, every once in a while, there's a communal structure, whether it's for a council house or a communal bathhouse, or that's not clear yet. But this is typical of a city that was in the margin between the steppes and the forest in the Ukraine. And I'll come up with the date of when these cities existed in Ukraine and Moldova. They thrived from around 4,100 BCE to 3,300 BCE. And here's, a sad story about everything going round and round. These Moldavian and Ukrainian cities were, they left history when the population was enslaved and the area was colonized by the Greek city-states. So city-states in the model of the Anunnaki kingdoms came in and replaced these essentially democratic, living off the land settlements. Well, they're bigger than settlements, they were cities. Okay? And they're not the only ones. There were, matter of fact, there are some remnants. The settlements of the Basque people, particularly the ones in the southwest of France, and the Basque language, like the Sumerian language, has no connection with any other language group on the planet. I don't know if anybody has ever tried to look to see if there's a link between Sumerian and Basque, but I don't know. I don't know that anybody has looked and failed to find it. Anyway, the Basque communities, the traditional ones, are based on equality of all households, and many of them are actually built in a circular plan. The city, the town, they're not all that big, are built in a circular ring of houses. Okay, I mean, this is a little bit out of order, but it's one of the inspiring things in this book. There's no doubt that something has gone terribly wrong with the world. A very small percentage of its population do control the fates of almost everyone else, and they are doing it in an increasingly disastrous fashion. To understand how this situation came about, we should trace the problem back to what first made possible the emergence of kings, priests, overseers, and judges. Okay, I'd love to get in touch with this guy, though. I'm afraid that I'll bump. I'm going to try, but I'll bump into the fact that, hey, fella, I got enough trouble already. I don't have to go into this alien madness. I got enough trouble as it is. And that's okay. That's okay. A step at a time, right? But we no longer have the luxury of assuming that we already know in advance what the precise answers will turn out to be. Amen. Taking guidance from indigenous critics like Candiarank, we need to approach the evidence of the human past with fresh eyes. Right. Now, after the flood of around 11,000, 11,500 BCE, that's the tsunamis that destroyed Mesopotamia, and somewhere around that time, give or take 1,000 years, the world flood caused by the, help me out, can't remember the name of the event, the meteor shower that decimated the ice cap over North America and raised the something Dryas event. Anyway, remember Linda? What's the name?
The younger Dryas.
Younger Dryas event. Thank you. Thank you. I hate when that happens. Anyway.
Can I ask a quick question? So this book doesn't postulate aliens.
No.
Okay. So they're coming to the conclusion that I've got to admit, I bought a little summary of this book and it was unreadable. So I gave up. But they're basing this on what?
They're basing it on these excavations that are relatively recent. Relatively recent,
Okay.
and are not, they are discordant with established theories, in archaeology and anthropology.
So, but they don't mention the fact that the Sumerians thought it was aliens.
No, no, they right, they are looking, they're not looking very much at the documentary evidence. They're not looking at the tablets and the carvings. They're looking at the imprint on the ground.
Right.
Okay.
Mhm.
Now, I don't know where to tap in here. The flood, so we're talking around 11,000, 12,000 BCE, and then around 7,000 years pass before the cities, the pre-flood cities, the cities of the gods in which the humans were happy slaves, get rebuilt. About 7,000 years passes. And all I could say in evolution diverted at that point in time, was, well, it took that long for the human population to recover after the flood, in order for there to be a basis to man these new cities. Well, maybe in that 7,000 years is approximately 2 cycles of Nibiru. Maybe after the great destruction that they caused, the Anunnaki went home for a couple of cycles and then came back when the humans had developed in terms of numbers enough, and decided to reestablish their colony. Now, a lot of what these 2 Davids are positing is what happened, in those 7,000 more or less years, as cities of this kind that I just showed you a picture, in a great variety of types, as they developed the kind of basic skills, not of non-civilized or organized life. There was a mix of kind of like farmers, Neolithic farmers, and Mesolithic foragers and hunters. And the Fertile Crescent that we know, going from Sumer, from southern Iraq, through Iraq and Syria, and then down through Lebanon and Canaan, actually was 2 crescents. There was a northern crescent and a southern crescent. Okay, and farming first arose on the northern crescent, which was hilly, the footlands of the mountains, and I hypothesized, and it's probably right, that that's where farming was possible, even though the soil was thin and the slopes not so advantageous because the lowlands were covered initially in deep mud and took thousands of years to fully dry out because the mud was quite deep. So there were two crescents and an upland northern one where the well-studied settlement of Catalhoyuk was founded around 7000 BCE, and then the lowland crescent, which was a trading culture, and cities and settlements were settled there, such as Jericho, which is very, very old. Okay, it means moon city, but the god of the moon, Nanar Sin, he came back later. Okay, now let me hang on a moment. So what was the Fertile Crescent? It's important to note this is a completely modern concept. The origins of what are as much geopolitical as environmental. It's a term invented in the 19th century when Europe's imperial powers were carving out the Middle East. Term became widely adopted amongst researchers to describe an area, as we said, from the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, through the foothills of the Zagros Mountains in Iran, through Syria, Turkey, and Iraq, down to the Gulf. It's not really one crescent, but ecologically it's two, as I just said. Anyway, there's a lot of interest in the interplay between those two portions of the crescent. Sorry if I'm not making that terribly clear, but just a mountain of material that I'm going to try to cover all of. So going back to the archaeological evidence, relatively recent, okay? I mean, we're talking about the last 25, 30, 40 years, not organized enough to dominate the cultures of those sciences, as Max Planck said, science advances one funeral at a time, and it's just going to take a while for this. I mean, this evidence, if it's like 30, 40 years old, isn't new, but it's new as far as established archaeology and anthropology are concerned. Okay, so let's go back to the evidence. Settlements inhabited by tens of thousands of people make their first appearance in human history around 4000 BCE. Okay, so that's around the same time, not too far off from when the Anunnaki came back and reestablished their colony in Mesopotamia. So a lot is going on elsewhere on the planet, which is completely, so it's in the archaeological record that's now being unearthed, but it's of no interest at all to the Mesopotamian tablets from Sumer and Akkadian and Assyria, because they didn't care about other people. They didn't care about the humans who weren't under the rule of the Anunnaki lords. They were irrelevant. Okay, so they appear on every continent, at first in isolation, and then they multiply. One of the things that makes it so difficult to fit what we now know about them into this old-fashioned evolutionary sequence that dominates the social sciences, where cities, states, and bureaucracies and social classes all emerge together, is just how different these cities are from civilized cities and also from each other, because there's a huge variety. It's not just that some early cities lack class divisions, wealth monopolies, or hierarchies of administration. they exhibit such extreme variability as to imply from the very beginning a conscious experimentation in urban form. Contemporary archaeology shows that surprisingly few of these early cities contain signs of authoritarian rule. In other words, palaces, temples, royal enclaves. It also shows that their ecology was far more diverse than once believed. Cities do not necessarily depend on a rural hinterland in which serfs or peasants engage in backbreaking labor, hauling in carloads of grain for consumption by urban dwellers. Certainly, that situation became increasingly typical in later ages. In other words, after Anunnaki-inspired organization spread and took over, because it's, you know, so damn successful. You know, like these Ukrainian, Moldavian circular cities got wiped away and became colonies of the Greek city-states. But in the first cities, small-scale gardening and animal keeping were often at least as important. So too were the resources of rivers and seas, which is where they were all located. Okay. And for that matter, continued hunting and collecting of wild seasonal foods in forests or in marshes. The particular mix depended largely on where in the world the cities happened to be. But it's becoming increasingly apparent that history's first city dwellers did not always have a harsh imprint on the environment or on each other. Those who are, into, modern, relatively modern 20th century versions of that kind of model will have called to mind the garden cities proposed, and a few of them built actually in England by Ebenezer Howard, the Garden Cities movement. A little stab was made in that direction in the United States with Greenbelt, Maryland, during the Depression, and Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City. Archaeologists still have much to find out about the distribution of these world's first cities. They also indicate how much older these cities may be than the systems of authoritarian government and literate administration that were once assumed necessary for their foundation. Since the top-down monarchical model took over, we've assumed that it was necessary and inevitable. It's just very successful. Similar revelations are emerging from the Maya lowlands, where ceremonial centers of truly enormous size, presenting no evidence of monarchy or stratification, can now be dated as far back as 1000 BC. And then those non-monarchical, non-hierarchical cities seem to have adopted the culture from elsewhere in Mexico and became what later became known as the classical Mayan culture. That was 1,000 years before the rise of classic Maya. This in turn raises a fascinating but difficult question. What held the earliest experiments in urbanization together, other than reeds, fibers, and clay? What was their social glue? It's a high time for some examples, okay? And then there's going to be some speculation about how all that developed. showed you this map. We should consider if the inhabitants of these mega sites, these non-hierarchical, usually circularly arranged cities, consciously manage their ecosystems to avoid large-scale deforestation. It's consistent with archaeological studies of their economy, which suggest a pattern of small-scale gardening, often taking place within the bounds of the settlement, combined with the keeping of livestock. Possibly that's the function of the large circular central space. It's a natural pasture land. Cultivation of orchards and a wide spectrum of hunting and foraging activities. The diversity is actually remarkable, as is its sustainability. And he goes on to list all the variety of basically wild foods that were grown, and they were hunters. The important thing is that these were basically wild foods that were grown in these cities, very different than the cultivated fruits and vegetables and grains that were grown in the Mesopotamian cities under the gods, who it's not clear whether they developed varieties out of the wild ones or whether they imported them. That's not clear. Many things, I guess, not clear. As I said, popular assemblies were a feature of all the societies of Mesopotamia and the Mesopotamian diaspora, like in Turkey and Canaan. And these were the cities in Anunnaki dominance, but were they preserved from the post-flood settlements? I suspect that they were, but we don't know what mix of democratic, oligarchic, and monarchic forces were at play, and probably quite varied over time. Take a cross section of any one of these cities, and you would see a certain principle of organization dominant, but 500 years later, it might be one of the other ones that's dominant. So one of the things that they seem to be learning is that there's a fluidity between which of the principles is really ruling or running that culture. Is it essentially democratic, essentially oligarchic, essentially monarchic? So it's very likely that that the Anunnaki at around 3000 to 4000 BCE reimposed their structure on a regrowing, restoring human population, on cities that were already developing in a basically democratic way, and they superimpose their structure. That doesn't mean by force, because it may have been that we were a servant race, but it's easy to read the tablets to indicate that we were happy slaves. Serving the god, serving the king, and serving the city were all the same. Like that's one way to read this history. Because there's no indication that the brutality that one god and his army, showed to a competing god and his army, that brutality characterized the culture of the city itself. It seemed actually that they were relatively brutal to the enemies and relaxed with their loyal subjects. And as a matter of fact, the kings who served under the, under the deified Anunnaki, the kings were known as shepherds, good shepherds. They were not tyrants. Tyranny is a bastardization of monarchy. It isn't a necessary endpoint of monarchical rule, any more than mob rule is a necessary endpoint for democracy. So, I talked about in the 18th century, this indigenous critique of Western civilization. The impact of self-governance, personal freedom, and a rather sophisticated philosophy of life. So, when I put together, an understanding of how the United States system arose, it came from the English political philosophers, the French Enlightenment writers, from the Dutch example, not philosophy, because they just did it. They didn't really write about it, And I said, and they absorbed the natural form of communal discussion, from the natives surrounding the colonies. I had no idea that the natives had actually affected the philosophes in France, and that the French egalitarian tradition was very much native inspired. Okay. And those who have gotten into native traditions understand that they weren't just skilled with making fire and knowing how to process deer hides and how to live off the land in a very economical way. The average adult in North America had to work about 20 hours a week in order to provide food, shelter, and clothing. Recent studies have looked at how they actually survived. They had an easy, well, I wouldn't say easy life, but they had a life of great freedom, which allowed them to develop their spirituality, and their philosophical sophistication. They were, primitive only in that they didn't have steel to make axes with, but in no other sense were these primitive people whatsoever. So there was a Mississippian culture and of settlements that involved huge pyramids that were and mounds, often in animal shapes, serpent-like shapes on the ground, that were built with structural sophistication. If you pile up mud, okay, and build 100-foot high pyramid, in just plain mud, it's going to disappear very fast with rain. Okay. But these structures were actually built with some sophistication, layers of other material, stones. So it was earth, stones, earth, stones. So these structures lasted, have lasted until the present, hundreds and hundreds of years. Important to remember that in the tradition of the culture that followed them, the Indian culture that the Westerners met in the first in the late 16th, but then 17th and 18th centuries, they referred to the builders of the mounds and the pyramids as giants. Got to remember that, okay? And then we have to ask, well, where did they go? I think they just don't know whether they died out, literally, or simply melted into other racial stocks. And as I joked, they're reemerging in the NBA and the NFL. But these cities were in parts of sophisticated trading networks. I mean, there are cities in northern Louisiana, that have artifacts from the Great Lakes and from the Gulf Coast. So vast trading networks. And layouts that were astronomically and geometrically sophisticated, with these, as I said, did these evolve out of the human mind? Were these remnants of Mesopotamian culture that were passed down, maybe orally? What were the migration routes that then would have brought these cultures to North America and to Mexico and to South America? We don't know. We do know that the Olmec heads in Mexico, these giant heads that are about taller than a human, these big boulders that are carved in faces, those are clearly African faces. We don't know how they got there. Now, here's something cool. The Great Law of Peace of the Iroquois Federation, which influenced Franklin, influenced his plan. It was called the Albany Plan, which influenced the Articles of Confederation, which influenced the Constitution. Okay, that law was a thoughtful human creation, evolved over a great deal of time from the earlier conflict-ridden, chaotic period amongst all the tribes. So it's not just the idea of having a foundational law that we inherited from the natives. The very process of having a national Congress, to having a constitutional convention, the process of evolving that law was also adopted, from them. That's what they did to come up with their law. That's what we did to come up with ours. So transmitted through the natives came, I would say, aspects of natural law. It's a philosophical tradition of natural law, law that comes out of the land itself, out of the forest, out of the animals, out of the lakes. That when humans look at themselves, they can evolve principles of social organization that are analogous to what we see in the ecological organization of nature. Side note, recently I read the autobiography of one of my hero teachers from Penn, Ian McHarg. Jim, did you know about him when you were at Penn? You're muted. Ian McHarg was really the founder of of ecological, one of the founders of ecological science.
Yeah. Yeah. He had a sabbatical the year I took the course, but the people that stepped in for him were just formidable.
Yeah, it was one of the most popular courses in the university.
Yeah, actually, I'm in a way kind of glad that I missed him in person, because that would have been an extra kind of layering of formidality on the subject.
Oh, he was formidable. I can attest. I worked in his office for a while.
Uh-huh. And you survived.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, you know, and he developed an ecological model for regional actually for large scale landscape and regional planning, and then he extended it. He tried his best to extend it to human ecology. Anyway, so there's this natural basis for law, and that was through the natives that became, and through the native influence on the French, that became a powerful current in developing our system as it originated in the 18th century, late 18th century, and evolved. Yeah.
It is how well known is the fact that did the founders write about this? Where's
not much.
Well, see, it's these people obviously came up with this from something other than archaeology.
Yes.
If they're saying that and I find this fascinating, and I love the idea, and I'm inclined to believe it. So I really need to know where the information came from.
Well, all right. I mean, I quoted, I guess the book is available in English. You have to dig for it, but Curious Dialogues with a Savage of Good Sense Who Has Traveled. Major work by Lahontan, Lahontan, a French minor nobleman who spent time in New France, Canada. Okay.
Okay. And so, but surely the founders, if their thinking was I mean, they wrote all about why they thought the way they thought, didn't they? And wouldn't they have said this is where it came from? Or is this another sort of hidden racism in the consciousness of the species that will not allow us to acknowledge this?
It's number one, hidden racism, but number two, it's the escape from the shame of having gotten our goodies from others. Okay, the humans coming out in post-Anunnaki world, falling into the trap of we did it ourselves. Okay, I mean, when the Greeks developed their astronomy, okay, the Ptolemaic system, and as astronomy advanced, they had the illusion that they were developing it de novo. They were only rediscovering, what the Mesopotamians learned from the Anunnaki, 4,000 years earlier. Okay, so this conceit that we did it ourselves, okay, is we didn't get it from primitive people, and we didn't get it from the gods. We did it ourselves. Who knew who could admit otherwise amongst the founders? Again, they had to establish their own validity. They couldn't be rebels. They couldn't simply be enemies of the king, because to be disloyal was the greatest sin on earth. No, they made it a case that they were being simply better. They just wanted their rights as Englishmen, you know. Anyway, the only people that I know of who acknowledged the superiority of native culture were Thomas Paine, who was a pretty biting critic of civilized culture, you know, and indirectly Ben Franklin, you know, who noted that, you know, so many white guys voted with their feet. They had a chance, you know, and went back to the woods.
Because this, I mean, I've read a fair amount, and this is new information for me. The only part that it was real clear and that get commented over and over again was how bad the Europeans smelled.
Yes, that was one of the high points of their criticism. Yes.
It was like, and the European, and it's funny because as a virologist, I will tell you that the habits of the Europeans bringing their animals in to their houses is the reason we have almost all our infectious diseases. Measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, they're all directly related to that behavior. I would say compare, you know, and the natives had very little of that. They knew better than to bring animals inside. Somehow they knew. I just think it's fascinating.
You know, in other words, I mean, there's this joke, like, you know, don't shit where you eat, you know, but the natives had, you know, don't let your animals shit where you eat.
Well, exactly. Well, don't
actually, there was an article in the Times a couple of weeks ago that, okay, you know, we talk about spillover, say from the bats, you know,
right,
the markets in Wuhan to humans, you know, and now we have to face spill back because we're giving it back to animal populations where the viruses are going to mutate further, and then they give it back to, and then there's a fresh wave of spillover. Okay, there's theorization that that actually Omicron came from an animal reservoir in South Africa. In other words, there was spillback to some animal population, maybe rodent, you know, and then came back to the humans. And that the huge number of strange, you know, mutations in Omicron were the result of the virus adapting to a totally different species. Adapting,
yeah, or growing unrestricted in the population of HIV positive people in Africa. Are you aware of how many HIV positive people there are in Africa?
Right. So so they're a great reservoir.
So the virus is going to replicate almost unrestricted in them. I don't think there's ever been a virus on the planet that has done what this one. I mean, just in terms of the sheer numbers. But you were talking before, and I just kind of wanted to throw this back at you, is you were talking about the natives somehow having an ability to appreciate something about natural law.
Yes. Yeah.
I believe, knowing what I know about how it works, the way the biology on this planet works, you don't sleep with other species. I mean, it's really that simple. I mean, I don't know as I would have really predicted it, but we did the experiment in the Middle Ages, and it's created this vast reservoir of infectious disease for us. And if somebody could sense that was the case, I would find that first of all, I'm inclined to believe that's true. And based on my own experiences, sometimes you can feel things that you can't think, right?
Right.
So that's what you're talking about.
Yeah. Okay. So that the rats in Europe, you know, were even a far deeper problem than the fleas that they carried that gave a Black Death. that there's a whole other level of trouble coming.
Well, that's bacteria. That's even
Yeah.
another
Yes.
level. I'm just talking about
That's what
viruses.
I'm saying. But aside from the bacteria and the fleas, then you have other things going on at the viral level with the rats in Paris and also right now in New York. Um,
So I just wanted to throw that in. Natural law being what it is.
Well, I mean, there's the law of nature, and then there's human natural law running in parallel or derived from. Ooh. One question about the what I call the Mississippian civilization of the Mississippi Valley. A number of settlements. One of the most thoroughly studied is a place called Poverty Point in central Louisiana. But question is, well, why did they fade out? Because they were pretty successful. You're talking about a 400-acre settlement, with mounds and 10, 20,000 people, and the several structures aligned with significant astronomical points, the rising point of Venus at the equinox. I mean, things, pretty sophisticated things like that. Why did they fade out? Now, it could be that they were imposed on the land, that they brought their version of Mesopotamian civilization, but that the landscape itself, the plains, the rivers, this verdant this verdant land that they were in, very different than Mesopotamia, which is pretty dry, had a democratizing effect, and they faded, possibly because they had no gods to embody any top-down organization. And so the very purpose for having the mounds, which maybe they just copied because that was what they knew. You have a city, you have a pyramid. That's what defines city. But they had no reason to have it because they didn't have gods. So maybe the cultures melted away, but the mounds didn't. The white settlers often used them they mined the mounds for building materials.
How proximate are these mound cities to the plains buffalo?
Probably not so much, because the buffalo were not really much in the Mississippi Valley. They were a bit to the west in the high plains, right?
Yeah, Texas.
Yeah.
I don't know about Louisiana.
I don't know how much they depended upon on the buffalo.
Or if in a time of famine, they discovered they could, if they just moved away a little bit, not too far, they could find some meat.
Yeah. So, one, right, maybe, yes, that's right. Maybe we don't know why, maybe they didn't just fade away, maybe they shifted, maybe they, maybe they like Dillinger, maybe they went where the money was, and it was in buffalo meat and buffalo hides, could be. If this gives us some thought about, some reason to think about, well, okay, the monarch is the embodiment of the city, the whole culture. And in Anunnaki times, the monarch was also the embodiment of a planet. So it isn't necessarily a bad thing to have a king. England isn't doing so badly, nor Denmark, nor Norway. And tyranny is one possible outcome, but not inevitable. Obviously, that inclination to be in the thrall of the king can be manipulated. And when the populace, or part of the populace, is in dire straits, or is in decline, or is in fear, it can be manipulated. They become quite gullible and can be manipulated, into supporting a perverted version of leadership. One of the things that I'm getting from these studies of these various, hugely varied forms of organization of cities before civilization came and gave it, this is the state, and this is how it is, and this is the king, and these are the nobles, and these are the serfs, and then in the middle arise the professionals, the weavers, maybe, and the lawyers. Where was I? Forget what direction I was going. I'm sorry. There's this huge variety. What I'm getting is that it's very fluid, and once you take off an imposed and somewhat rigidified structure, who knows what's going to arise. So we have a cross section now of what's moving, the advanced nations, Europe, much of the Americas, we have a cross section of what's of governance. We really don't know what the great forces are, and what's going to happen. That we thought we had a pretty fixed deal. At least we thought it, from, you might say, the post-war period. Okay, 1945, maybe 2005, 2015, something like that. We thought we had this is the deal. Okay, but that's not very long, is it? And we are in a very fluid time. The only, as I may have said before, the only thing we know for sure is that we don't know for sure. I happen to believe that faith can have a huge impact on direction, on what evolves. And have I told you I'm producing a movie? Tell you more, but it's I've leaked some, okay. But it's a sci-fi feature set in the near future, when we truly begin to save ourselves and our world. Redemption through startling self-discovery. And I'm starting to seek what are known as impact investors. People who are interested in doing some good and would take an opportunity to do well by doing some good for the world. It's like all movies, it'd be a high risk investment, but I'm looking for those characters. Got to find enough of them to get the ball rolling, which is good. I haven't yet started to roll the ball. It's very close. I got some more preparation to do. But if you happen to know of some people.
Boy, it seems like it would be an awfully good time to be trying to raise a little money. I understand the moneyed class has done very well over the last couple of years. And so it's similar, my father invested in a movie. I inherited the total loss, actually. And which is why I know about it. And this is similar, it seems to me, financially, a little similar to that time.
The timing, you mean?
Yeah, but yeah, which was unfortunately in the late 90s. Ooh. So right before things went, well, I mean, things were just really, everybody had a lot of money to invest. So might be a really good time to do this.
It might be. It might be.
Mike, is it am I naive to think that the GoFundMe type culture now of finances would not be appropriate for you? I mean, do you need really just a handful, or just 2 or 3 deep pockets? I mean, look at the amount of money that was raised in just a week or a couple of weeks by the Canadian truckers thing.
Right, I was just thinking about that. The Canadian.
I mean, 10 million is not a lot for a movie, but they weren't doing anything. They were doing something. They weren't doing anything entertaining.
I don't think the GoFundMe route, because you have to. Yeah, this is. It's not easy to sell the idea of this movie. Okay. And
well, I think it would take, you would not be that person selling the idea of this.
Initially, I will be. I have to be. Initially.
Oh, well, then let's not take that route.
Right. No, the GoFundMe route reminds me, there's an analogous. I was just thinking about this, and I mentioned the incident to Delia today. During Adlai Stevenson's campaign against Ike, one of his fans said, "Well, Mr. Stevenson, Governor Stevenson, you should know that every thinking person in America is on your side."
Yeah,
to which he replied,
yeah,
"Yeah, but I need a majority."
Yeah. Yeah, all three of them. If someone taking it to the financing for the GoFundMe would not sell the intellectual apparatus that you've constructed,
Yeah,
they would sell the wild and amazing stuff. It would be a P.T. Barnum type sales, and you would go in several different directions because there's several areas where the populace in general can contribute $10 to $500.
but they,
This is a big country. There's a lot of bread out there.
yeah, but how far do you get, saying, well, the real key to understanding, our goddamn mess is that we're a hybrid species.
Oh, I wouldn't even,
You know?
I wouldn't, I mean, I wouldn't do any work that somebody else, I would, if I were doing it, and I'm not capable, I'm not adept at that. But I would look for somebody who would sell the entertainment part, skip the mess part.
Well, yes, but
It's just money. You want the money later for the message.
it's both. It's both. I mean, right now it's out of the GoFundMe range. The budget is 20 million plus or minus 5.
Yeah.
To make it really convey what the screenplay is at the moment, without chopping it up. So we're talking about a few deep pockets, but not that many. Not that many. And I won't. Once the ball gets rolling, it picks up. The snowball picks up more snow. So soon. I'm not quite ready to start rolling it down the hill, so to speak. So these guys, spent a lifetime in archaeology and anthropology, and it comes up with a book which is this thick. Sorry, Linda, that the extract was unreadable. The book is not unreadable, but it meanders a great deal. Okay, and is highly repetitive. Very academic. But good academic.
The little bit that I can't remember what it called itself was written in a language that I found pretty inaccessible. So it was bizarre, but they obviously admired the basic premise and conclusions of the book, whatever they were.
Well, you may have you may have come across an example of, with friends like that, I don't need enemies.
You're right, exactly.
I mean, because the best way, and my mentor in architecture, lit up, when I said this in an informal meeting we're having, the best way to kill something is to copy it without any of the life, the vitality, that went into the original powerful creation. That's the, you don't have to oppose it. Be a friend, but a jerk of a friend. And that's the best way to squash something, and to some extent, it comes out of unconscious envy on the part of the follower, for the pioneer and for the inventor. The follower knows that he's just a copyist, and has a deep hostility for the pioneer that he or she is not. You know, there are some really helpful and positive followers, but there's this other brand. You know, so you may have encountered the work of one of those. You know, that turned you off to this book, right? Turned you off.
Yeah.
Right.
It was just inaccessible. I was hoping that I didn't have to read the 500 pages.
Well, Mike, you read the 500 pages?
Oh yeah.
Okay, so what is there an overarching theme? You know, I mean, from what you said, I think there is.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, it's not unalloyed, but and there is ambiguity, but the discovery, the presentation in bold type is that large human settlements existed apparently without severe authoritarian type government.
Right. And that we don't really know how that top-down rule, at least without the Mesopotamian tablets, we don't know how top-down rule, how the modern state developed, how it came about.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know how it got superimposed on earlier, highly varied, but not rigidified, not authoritarian civil cultures.
Yeah.
We don't know how it evolved. We do know that those cultures were evolving in diverse directions, you know, responding to their landscapes, responding to their histories, responding to their contact with different cultures, you know, hundreds, 1,000 miles away, that they absorbed ideas along with the artifacts that they traded with. We know that it was very fluid on Earth until the Anunnaki, we know, I mean, hypothesis, you know, until the Anunnaki reimposition of the original colonial structure. I mean, the colonial structure was very simple. It was a hierarchical transplant from Nibiru with a hybrid servant race doing the grunt work. That was a really simple, you know, structure. And then at the same time, there were these escapees pre-flood who seeded, SEEDED, seeded developments on all the continents except all the continents except Antarctica. Yeah, and what they're saying is we don't know, and what I'd like to say to them, well, consider this. Consider this to help fill in the we don't know. How it arose.
So can I just ask one more question about interpretation of Sumerian tablets?
Yeah, please.
Why do we can translate the tablets, right? Wasn't that part of the Rosetta Stone? I mean, we know what they say.
I don't think the Rosetta Stone, I don't know what the earliest language in the Rosetta Stone was. There were 4 languages, I believe. I don't know what the earliest was. You're muted, Reeve, if you're trying to contribute. There's a lot of art in ancient translation.
Well, that's sort of what I'm asking here, because Sitchin obviously got Anunnaki and alien and And did anybody before him have that interpretation of those words? I just wonder. I understand the power of denial, but it's just, I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out how all this fits together.
Well, earlier than Sitchin, who was publishing in the 70s.
Right.
Earlier was again, it's bits and pieces. Earlier was Velikovsky, but
Right.
but he was talking about planetary events.
He didn't talk about aliens at
He
all.
was not talking about beings from extraterrestrials. Von Daniken was, but on the basis of, I think, kind of cultural interpretation and archaeology. He was making, I don't think he was basing his understanding and his books on anything documentary, at least ancient documentary. I don't think so. He was the Chariots of the Gods was the first one. I think there were very few who went back earlier than the Hebrew Bible, and said, well, this must have happened and that must have happened. I don't know that anybody took literally, who the giants, the Anakim, the sons of Anak, who they really were. So long, Steve. Who I don't think anybody thought that they were related to. Anyway, Jim, good night. See you next time. If this is February the 7th, the next time would be March the 7th. So no, I think Sitchin was the first, and in his autobiographical version, it came to him as a child when they were translating from Genesis, and it came to the portion where they talk about those who came down, the Nephilim, okay, which in Hebrew is those who came down, ones who descended, and it always translated as giants, the age when they were giants in the earth, this little guy, the Yiddish term is little pisher, raises his hand and he says, well, why are you calling them giants? The word is people, guys, beings who came down, and he was told to sit down and shut up, which fortunately stimulated curiosity rather than crushed spirit. Many others may have raised the same question and shut up for the rest of their lives, but I don't think anybody went back further, than to say, well, there were these giants. Who knows what that means? That there were these, the most famous being, of course, being Goliath. But giant beings appear in several places in Genesis and Exodus. And the sun, well, stopping in the sky, but that's another story. So no, and you know, and people have Sitchin's translations, you know, have been challenged, you know, in the same way that some of the, just, you know, some of the archaeology, you know, that's cited in this book, you know, gets dismissed as it's invention. It couldn't possibly, they couldn't possibly really have been meaning flesh and blood giants, you know. The gods were flesh and blood giants, yeah, and they had these powerful weapons that wiped out a whole army. Yeah, I mean, you know,
And they flew too.
and they flew, right. They flew from place to place on earth, you know, and if Ezekiel said that he went up in one of their ships and got transported from Babylonia to Jerusalem, well, Ezekiel was crazy. He had to be crazy. He was just talking about a vision. It could not possibly have actually happened, you know. So, you know, I can't think of any examples right now, but there have been, there's the famous one about, you know, and it probably is based in some reality, that aeronautical engineers, you know, analyzing the wing size and muscular structure of bees, you know, concluded that it's absolutely impossible for the bees to fly.
Right.
You know, it just can't be. You know, so and it's true that given a certain thought structure, given a certain assumption of what are unquestionable facts, then you know, it can't be. You know, one of the biggest examples right now in our culture is the belief that got established as fact, but it, you know, never really was, that space is empty and there's no such thing as the ancient idea of the ether, of a mass-free stuff that generates everything. That there is no, that space is empty except for sparse atoms. Okay, that became the hypothesis. Okay, that became fact. And if that's fact, then directly resulting from that is the Big Bang Theory. I don't want to get into why that is, but if you accept that as fact, that space is empty except for sparse atoms, then you wind up with the theory that the universe exploded out of nothing at one point in time and it's been blowing up ever since. Okay, which is totally counterintuitive and is based on a false assumption that because in actuality, what the ether, what the stuff, the fundamental stuff of the universe is doing is absorbing energy from light coming from distant galaxies and shifting it towards the red, taking energy out of the light itself, which accounts for the redshift. The redshift is not an artifact of what's it called when the siren drops in pitch when it leaves you. Something or other effect. Anyway, you know, it's now gotten to be, you know, assumed that's what happened. That's science now has proven that the universe started with a Big Bang. You know, all of it's based on you know, a politically, scientifically, politically motivated truth that took over astrophysics, you know, in the early 20th century. Until the fallacious basis of that disproving of the existence of the ether, until that's just, you know, widely accepted, we're going to have this nonsense, which of course doesn't, who cares? I mean, it doesn't affect anything at all, you know. It affects some theology, but other than that, it doesn't, you know, it doesn't have any direct impacts, so nobody really cares. Probably in a deeper sense it does, but that's another story, and I'm getting hoarse.
I always assumed that the Big Bang was the only way you really could explain everything and have matter primary over consciousness.
No.
No? What's the physics effect of when the siren is high pitch when it's coming towards you and low pitch? It's a Doppler effect.
Doppler effect. Okay. Thank you. Okay.
Yes.
The red shift, the further a galaxy is away from us, the more the light is shifted into the red in the spectrum. Okay.
Right.
And what physics has been saying since about 1920, 1915, 1920, is that that's a Doppler effect. And therefore, the further away a galaxy is, the faster it's receding from us, who are somewhere near the center of the galaxy, of the universe, somewhere near it, you know, not too far from the center of the universe. And everything is expanding out, and the things that are the furthest out, you know, they started out with the greatest velocity, so therefore they're showing the greatest Doppler effect, okay? But it's not a Doppler effect at all if you say that the medium of space slightly and subtly absorbs energy from the light, so that the further away the light source is, the more it's going to be shifted through absorption. Okay, you can see this to some extent if you're on a road at night, a really straight road. I mean, there's some stretches of the northeast extension of the Pennsylvania Turnpike that work this way. Okay. And you can see headlights coming at you 2 or 3 miles away. And if you look closely, those headlights, now this is different now that we have LED lights, but when it was, you know, when it was a filament light, those headlights 2 miles away, as they come closer, they become bluer. They become less red. And that's because that very same car, that very same headlight, when it was way, way in the distance, if it's a somewhat humid night, is having energy absorbed from the light by the water molecules in the air, and to some extent the gas, but mostly the water molecules. So there really is a redshift in the headlights if you have a long enough view of them. Not many people have, have ever noticed this, but it's a demonstration of the falseness, of the Big Bang theory. Because as they get closer, they get bluer. And an easy way to see it is you look at the headlights that are 200 feet ahead of you, and you look at the ones that are 2 miles away. If you have this straight stretch of road, and see there really is a color difference. Okay. And that's what accounts for the absorption by the water molecules. So that's what's happening in space. But anyway, when I say it was a political scientific victory, because it was really the victory of the mechanists over the vitalists. Those two traditions go back at least to Greek natural philosophy. We don't know enough about Mesopotamian astrophysics. We don't know enough. Our history reliably starts, aside from astrology and astronomy and mathematics, which clearly start in Mesopotamia for us. Everything else starts in Greece and Egypt. We're blank there about what they understood. Well, we've done it again. Each time we have one of our meetings, I say, God, there's nothing left. What could we possibly talk about next time? We've run the well dry, but that doesn't seem to be the case. I don't know what's going to pop up between now and a month from now, but stay tuned. Thank you for being with me on this ongoing journey. I don't know that I'll have anything more to report on the cinema front in a month, but maybe I will. Who knows? We'll see what comes up with it. If nothing else, we can always take a deep dive into some portion of evolution diverted. For example, the American Civil War, and what that means for us now. Okay, blessings, peace. See you soon.